This is an overview for Chapter 3 in our Perspectives course as we begin to look at the linkage between theory and research. And we are going to just provide some foundation here so that we can apply some of these things in class. So the first thing we need to think about that we really haven't even asked yet is, what is a theory? And there are a lot of different answers to that question. What is a theory? One person says that it's really tentative answers to questions that occur to people as they mull over specific communication situations. You could think of that as a theory. You might think of those as your text talked about Fritz Heider, the psychologist, and how he says everybody has these naive theories going on in their head. When they don't really know a phenomena or how to explain something, they can create naive understandings or theories about what's going on. Another answer to the question by a famous scientist, Karl Popper, is that theories are nets cast to catch what we call the world, to rationalize, to explain, that we endeavor to make the mesh ever finer and finer, to refine our theories and our understanding of the world. And so that was Karl Popper's definition of a theory. The definition that I like is that a theory is really a systematic, plausible set of generalizations that explain some phenomena by linking constructs and variables. A construct is just a concept or an idea that you put a term to, and it captures an angle or a piece of reality. And then you put that together using an organizing principle, and it's internally consistent. So that's the definition of theory that we will be working from. Now, there are some things that theory promises to do for us. One is that it might organize experience for us. We have some things that happen and we want to make sense of them, so it organizes that. Sometimes it's helping us extend what we know by becoming what we call a heuristic, a thinking device or a thinking tool. Sometimes it simply stimulates and guides future research, further research. Sometimes it can help to focus our attention on a part of a process or a piece of a puzzle. Sometimes it just gives us a framework for thinking and acting. Sometimes it actually helps us predict things, predict outcomes and the success or efficiency of something. And then sometimes, if things are not the way we want them to be, the status quo is not okay, it helps us to trigger change and to realize when change actually needs to happen. Now, there's a couple of different kinds of approaches to theory and theorizing, and I want to lay the groundwork and begin talking about these using an analogy. And this analogy comes from Walter Truett Anderson, and he's using a baseball analogy to think about different ways of approaching the world and thinking about theory. So imagine you're an umpire and somebody asks you, hey, how do you know what the difference is between a ball and a strike? Well, the first objectivist umpire might say, well, there's balls and there's strikes, and I call them the way they are. Right? I see them and I call them exactly the way they are. There's balls and there's strikes and they're clearly different, and I call them the way they are. That would be an objectivist approach to reality, because that umpire thinks they can stand outside of the game and see clearly the difference between balls and strikes. Well, umpire number 2 says, well, there's balls and there's strikes, and I call them the way I see them. So this umpire is admitting that they see differently than someone else might see. And so we call this person a subjectivist, or others might think of it as a critical realist, that you are being real about the fact that you see things a particular way and somebody else might see them differently, and 2 umpires might call a certain throw or a certain pitch slightly differently based upon how they see it. So there's balls and strikes, I call them the way I see them. And then there's the constructivist or constructionist approach to the call. And this umpire says, there's balls and there's strikes, and they ain't nothing till I call them. Do you see what they did there? There's balls and there's strikes, and it's not a ball or a strike, it's simply a pitch, until the umpire, who has a certain amount of power over the reality of the game, and calls the ball or the strike. At this point, the umpire has that, he can construct reality and make that pitch a ball or a strike. And so that's the difference between paradigms of an empiricist or an empirical approach and an interpretive approach. And then we'll add the critical approach onto here. So from the empirical approach to the world, they are trying to explain what's going on in the world, and they see themselves separate from the world. They can stand back outside of the world and analyze it from an objective standpoint. What they're trying to do is generalize across a whole range of observations that can then apply to a large sample or population, right? So they're trying to generalize about many cases or observations that have similarities. The interpretive approach, they see themselves as situated in the world. So you are probing a world from a standpoint of being situated in the world. So you are involved in the actual research environment itself, and you see yourself impacting that research environment. Our hope as an interpretivist is to illuminate an individual case. And then, of course, you can aggregate across cases or look for trends and patterns across cases. But my goal is not to create some universal explanation, because I understand that each case is going to be slightly different. There are going to be different variables or features of each case that make them unique. And then the critical approach, what that adds, the critical approach is really, I would say, an offshoot or branch of the interpretive perspective. But the critical approach has another layer to it, in that their goal is to change the world. Both the empirical and the interpretive approach, they are not trying to change the world. Most of those scholars or researchers see themselves as value neutral. You're trying to understand the world and its uniqueness, but you're not trying to change it. That's not your objective. The critical researcher is trying to get involved in the world. They are involved in the context, and they're trying to change something. Because what they're doing is, and the application of theory is, critiquing a status quo or kind of an existing set of cases, and saying, here's what's wrong with it, or here's what needs to change in this. Now, certainly empirical interpretive people can make suggestions for change, but that's not their goal, is to change the status quo. They're trying to understand what's going on. Now, there are more approaches to knowing and theorizing that fall within these kind of three basic areas. The first is rhetorical theory, and from a rhetorical perspective, these folks are looking at developing art or strategic ways of speaking or messaging. And what they're trying to understand, usually by exploring a given message or a series of messages, is to understand motive. They are interested in rhetoric is all about understanding persuasion and influence. And so by looking at the artistry or the strategy used in a messaging or in a campaign, they're trying to understand motive, what's behind that messaging that makes it influential. We mentioned the scientific or empirical folks are interested in coming up with laws. They're looking for generalizable statements that they can make, and usually they're trying to understand cause and effect, that kind of relationship. We have a cause, and it's doing something, it's producing an effect. The interpretive folks, more human action. They want to understand why and how people act, and what the emergent rules are for how people act. And really, they're trying to understand meaning or significance. Not necessarily what is the law here, but what does this mean to you? And we'll tease out some of that in class as well. The critical people, we mentioned that they are often engaged in a research because they're trying to enact change, and often what they're trying to understand is people's voice or the power dynamic or relationship in a given scenario. And then there's a whole other area of theory that is systems theory, and it's out of all of the different approaches to knowing and theorizing, systems theory is really multi-level, because it can happen on an individual level, it can happen on a group or clique level, or it can happen on a systems whole organization level, if you want to think of it that way. And so their look at the world is more holistic. than any of the other approaches that have been mentioned. And your text talks a little bit about that holistic or wholeness of the systems approach. And what they're trying to understand is kind of the interaction between levels or parts of a process or people in a system. They are interested in that interaction between those levels. If we put these two together, you can see it brings up questions of determinism versus free will and kind of the nature of human nature, and then what is the value in our research and our questions. So from a free will versus deterministic perspective, scientists stress that there are forces that shape human behavior, whether they be biological or environmental, and those forces those outside forces are impacting human nature. And as we understand those forces, we can then understand human nature. From the interpretivist perspective, they feel that people are conscious of their environments and of their actions, and that they make choices. And if we understand how they're making choices and why they're making choices, they have free will. Then we understand what's going on in a scenario, how people are making those choices and what those choices produce. So what's the objective, or what's the value of research? From a scientific or empirical perspective, we are looking for truth or cause, and so the highest value is on objectivity, that the more objective we can be, the more truthful or real we're going to understand the world. From the interpretive perspective, we're really looking at freeing people in a sense. So freedom of choice is what makes us unique as humans. And so we try to, in our scholarship, understand how people can be the freest, how we can emancipate people from oppression and power and hegemony. That's as quick an overview as I could try to lay that foundation. We will explore and actually use these two perspectives and the different ways of knowing in class. We'll see you there.